All right, so yesterday we were working on the registration part of this, and we were looking to implement session management so that when you when you registered, you navigated to the profile page, but then the profile page remembered who you were. Since when we navigate and we go to a different page, the server does not remember that this is the same session. Okay, HTTP is by default is a stateless protocol, so any HTML request to the server is considered like a brand new session, right? So it doesn't remember one request from the next. Okay, it does not distinguish one from the next. So what we wanted to be able to do is that if I registered as Fred, and we registered, when it navigated to the profile page, it would remember that it was still Fred. Okay, and notice that that this is the feature that we wanted. That we navigated to the profile page, and it was able to retrieve the person who was currently logged in. So we had started working on that yesterday, and in the user service on the server. And on the register, we had added the user that we just created in the database. We added them to the as an attribute called current user, right? And this was actually working yesterday. Not quite sure why we thought it wasn't. And then once we navigate to the profile page, instead of what we did yesterday of hard coding and retrieving a particular user for a particular ID, instead. It would come to this URL profile where we're not passing any ID, right? So the client never knows what the ID is, right? There's no state management on the client. The client is completely stateless, right? It doesn't remember anything from one to the other. Instead, it relies on the server maintaining state information. Okay, so when we go to the server, the profile calls this GET request. And the GET request retrieves the user we had added to the session in current user. Here's we're going to retrieve it from as an attribute. Again, the same current. We need to remember where we stored it, right? And usually these would be well-defined, well-known tokens or strings that everybody would be familiar with as part of the project. Here we chose the string current user. Here we are retrieving it from the session. So here, when we registered, we set the attribute. So we stored it in the session. When we come back to the profile, we retrieve it from the session. Right? We cast it back to the original data type. We extract its ID, and then we go to the database. Say, hey database, retrieve for me the user whose ID is that ID. Okay. We could have just returned the user in the session. We could have just returned this right here. The return could have been here. Okay, but that's a suboptimal solution because it could be that from subsequent visits to the profile page, I could have updated the user, right? Changed my first name, last name. I added other information, my email, my phone number. I would have added other information about the user. Right, and so the user in the session is kind of stale, right? The only real thing that I care about in the user in the session is really the ID. The ID is the only thing that won't change over time, right? It has been permanently stored in the database with that ID, and that's a primary key that uniquely identifies this user. So I can always retrieve the very latest version of this user from the database, right? By finding that user with its ID, primary key. Understand? It might be that the rest of the information of the current user in the session is stale, right? Like for instance, they might have changed the password. So the password of the user in the session might be stale. But I don't care. I'm not using that anymore, right? The only real thing that uniquely identifies this user is that primary key. And that's what I'm doing. I'm getting the ID, and then I'm going back to the database for that user. Okay? And that guarantees me that in the profile, I always see the very latest. Make sense? Okay. The only other thing that we added here on the server is that we're passing, this is what we had yesterday, we're passing the username and password as part of the user. object that is being passed, is being posted from the client. That's what we had already. We built that. We built this yesterday, wasn't it? Okay, so we did that. The only difference here is that because I'm going to navigate after I log in, because I'm going to navigate to the profile, well, I'm going to retrieve that user from the database. And once I have that user, I know this is a current user now, right? If I have found him, right? If I found the person, I'm going to set the current user, and then I return the user. Then the client can navigate to the profile, and the profile will have the very latest current user updated from the login. So depending who logs in, they get a different user in the session. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. On the client side, I did have to make a small change. The login, I did have to add credentials include. Right. This is what tells the client, the browser, when you're going to generate this post. Okay, make sure to include the cookie, right, that the server sent you. Right, because the server, every time you start a session, the server sends you a cookie called JSession ID, right? And so that the server understands that it's the same session, this configures this post, right? It configures it to include that cookie. So the server says, it's still you, right? So we're all in the same session with the same discussion, right? This is not a brand new HTTP request. Well, it is, but it's participating in the same session as before. Make sense? That's how it allows the request from the login to then be in the same session as in the profile, so that this session here that was used to store the user in the session in the login will be the same session from where you would get the user from the session. Yes?
Where is this session getting stored?
By default, it gets stored in the RAM of the CPU. Right. So, I'm sorry?
On the client side?
No. This is on the server. The server is running, right? And it instantiates a session object on the server that is mapped to the session ID. Right. The only thing that gets passed to the client, right, it's a JSession ID. Right, exactly. So this might look like this. So if you have I can't write with my right hand side. All right, so if you have two browsers, so this is user one, and you have two browsers. And here's the server, one server. All right, so the browser one makes a request, right, to log in. So I'm logging in. Okay. Well, first of all, the HTML. So I'm retrieving the login page. The server responds with the login page, right, and it's stored here locally, right. And the login page also retrieves what? The JavaScript. Right, the controller also gets downloaded. It gets downloaded and it gets all copied here in browser one. And browser two does the same thing, right? They both want to log in, right? So they both retrieve. But this one receives JSession ID 123 and just receives JSession ID 234. Okay, they both get different cookies, right, with different folks. Now, what the browsers are going to do is that this one's going to generate a post. Right, it's going to generate a post, right? A login post. But it's going to include credentials. That means that it's going to send this cookie as part of that request, right? So this sends in the cookie JSession ID also 123, and this one also, when they post to log in, they post it to a login. They send the 234 cookie, right? Now, what happens here is on the server will instantiate a session mapped to two different IDs. This one will be mapped to 123, and this one will be mapped to 234. But you don't do any of that. That's handled under the covers for you using the HttpSession, right? The HTTP session handles all this low-level stuff, okay? So you go here. Once you log in, what are we doing? We're going to a database. We're going to a database, retrieving the user, and we're storing the user in our session. So here's our current user, right, for this session over here. And this one logs in, and they also go to a database looking for a different user, right? And they store their current user in their own session ID, in their own HTTP sessions. Yes? All right? So the server this way can have multiple conversations with thousands of users, right? Each one with their own shopping cart, each one with their own preferences, everyone with their own things for their particular session. Okay? So I come in next and I go to my profile. I go to my profile and I ask for profile. And I say, include credentials. Here too, I go to profile and I say include credentials, meaning the same session ID. Everybody sends their own session ID, right? And says, okay, well now retrieve, for this session, retrieve the user from the session, right? Go look up this user by ID, and then return the user using that ID to the client for rendering. And same thing over here. I look up my user from here, I get the ID, go fetch the user from that with that ID, and then come back with that user to the client. See that? Everybody okay? All right. Now, session management, typically we try to make our applications as stateless as possible. Okay? Because this is expensive. Right? Maintaining session, right, is expensive. It increases the footprint of your server-side application. Right? If this is stateful, that means that if you have 1,000 users logged in at the same time, you need to instantiate 1,000 instances of this, right, on the CPU, right, where you're running. Yes. So you're increasing the footprint of this server side. If you don't have to remember, if you could delegate the session management to the client, right, where the client provides the ID every time, right, as opposed to the server remembering this. Right now, the state management would be on the client side. Every time, instead of using this JSession ID from the server, we could just remember who the ID is and maintain the session over here and send it over every time, so we don't have to remember. That's another architecture we'll take a look at a little later. Right, maintaining the session on the client side as opposed to on the server. Make sense? All right. Okay, and so I posted this on GitHub, so you should be able to see that. I posted it on this branch. If you want to take a look at that. So this is last one. So there's login, what I did to make it work. And you can take a look at the register and profile, what lines of code I changed to make it work. Okay? You can take a look at exactly what I did. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to registration and be able to create users and whatnot.